The world continues to grapple with COVID-19 and some things are changing. It seems that the vaccines wear off relatively quickly. The countries committed to zero COVID are failing to hold it together. The public debate is as moralistic and irrational as ever. And for some reason, people are taking medicine for horses. Well, let's take a look. Just a couple of months ago, it seemed hard to argue with the idea that there were two effective approaches to combating COVID-19. One was to act quickly and to go all in with major aggressive lockdowns in order to achieve zero COVID, at which point you could close the borders and aim to keep the virus out. China had done this using the coercive power of its authoritarian state, and Australia and New Zealand managed it, making the most of their relative geographical isolation, their ability to pull up the drawbridge. The other approach was to get everyone vaccinated as quickly as possible, at which point you could then supposedly return to normal life. Israel was the cheerleader for this, implementing an initial vaccination program that went to a higher percentage of the population more quickly than any other country. And it had shown the benefits. With people coming out of lockdown so successfully, they quickly abandoned the use of their vaccine passport scheme because it just wasn't needed. The UK's been a little way behind, but enjoying the benefits now of emerging from lockdown without seeing the initial case surge that some of the most pessimistic doctors had said was all but certain. Well, both of those approaches are to some degree in trouble right now. The problem with zero COVID is that it's a holding strategy. It buys you time. But ultimately, particularly with the Delta variant being that much more transmissible, if you don't pursue the vaccination program with some urgency, then you will find that the defences get breached and you have a population then of significant vulnerability. And the challenge then is that if you try to cope by doing the same thing that you did in the beginning, you're depending on the willingness of your population to endure the most extreme and aggressive lockdowns multiple times over and over. So Australia managed to keep deaths from COVID extremely low by world standards, 978 deaths. But the arrival of the Delta variant has tested its borders and found them wanting. New South Wales recorded 825 new cases in one 24-hour period, which certainly seems as though it may be over the line of what's able to be reined back into zero COVID status, which doesn't mean they're not going to try, of course, with various parts of the country thrown into a strict lockdown along with other measures. Amongst other measures, you can include telling people that they're not allowed to take masks off to drink alcohol outdoors. And you can also include shooting rescue dogs, which a rural council in New South Wales did in order to prevent volunteers from an animal shelter from going to collect them. Well, at least they're not shooting the people who are drinking alcohol outdoors, so that's a win, I suppose. But is it now too late? Sydney has been locked down since late June, but still infections have more than doubled in the past week. And as you would expect, over the weekend, we saw again clashes between the police and lockdown protesters in Melbourne and Sydney. Australia remains vulnerable because its vaccine rollout, for various reasons, has been slow. There have been problems getting hold of some of the supplies. The EU famously prevented a batch of vaccines going from its territory to Australia when it was struggling with its own slow start, for instance. But others have been clear that it has also been a failure in public administration. In July, ex-Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull said that the vaccine rollout had been a colossal failure. Currently, the figure of fully vaccinated adults in Australia is at 24%. And given that relatively few have had COVID to date, there will be minimal natural immunity to add to that number. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison is keen for states to open up, saying that people now had to move beyond a one-eyed focus on daily case numbers. In particular, he said once you got to 70% of the population vaccinated, then you should wholly abandon lockdowns. Not everyone's impressed with Australia's recent situation. New Zealand Premier Jacinda Ardern threw her country into a full lockdown with the discovery of just one case of the Delta variant, reportedly a 58-year-old man. As she announced the new restrictions, Ardern implied that it was in contrast to the lax attitude of the Australians. There are now 72 community cases in the country and 290 what are described as locations of interest. New Zealand vaccination rates are about the same as for Australia. Now, the reality, of course, is that although saying how ridiculous shutting down when there was only one case was arguably wrong, because overreacting in that way is the only way that you're going to potentially get on top of it in this zero COVID way. Once the number of cases has gone up, as Australia is showing, such measures stop working, because ultimately there are limits to what mandatory lockdowns can achieve in terms of compliance and behaviour change. But the question now is, after all this time, is this really a viable strategy for the long term in any case? New Zealand's COVID-19 response minister, Chris Hipkins, has started to acknowledge that the game may be up. He said this in reference to the Delta variant. It does change everything. It means that all of our existing preparations begin to look less adequate and raises some pretty big questions about the future of our long-term plans. Others have been less gentle about where the approach has led New Zealand. Matthew Lesh, the head of the UK's Adam Smith Institute, blasted the country's approach, saying that its strategy meant a once welcoming nation is turning into an isolated dystopia where liberties are taken away in a heartbeat and outsiders are shunned. So is the strategy of zero COVID now untenable? There are certainly some arguing that with the Delta variant's transmissibility, it's pushing the boundaries of what a democratic society can ask of its citizens in terms of repeated severe lockdowns. Now, of course, China is currently reporting no new cases for the first time since July, suggesting that its non-democratic society is still able to pummel people hard enough and fast enough. But they came close to losing control this time regardless. What they can also do, of course, is to push their people to get vaccinated fast. It's only because the Chinese vaccines have been less effective than the others that means that they aren't already on the way to that working for them. But then there's another aspect to that. The growing data showing that the second strategy, mass vaccination, is also having its challenges, namely that although the vaccines are very effective in reducing hospitalisations and deaths, they seem to wear off more quickly than we would have hoped, and significant breakthrough cases therefore remain possible. The implication of that is that eliminating COVID via herd immunity is unlikely to be within reach, however vaccine-friendly a population is. So living with COVID means a higher degree of tolerance for a number of people getting sick and dying than perhaps people thought it would have to be. So what do we know? As I mentioned earlier, Israel was the first mover on mass vaccination, which brought it significant early success. But it also therefore was the first to notice a gradual increase in the number of vaccinated people developing COVID-19. Therefore, it carried out studies to discover the degree to which protection was reduced. Some of the picture was complicated by the arrival of the Delta variant. The Pfizer vaccine saw its effectiveness decline from a high of 95% in May, pre-Delta, to 64% in early July, post the arrival of Delta. But then a report released on July 22nd found that the percentage effectiveness against infections and symptomatic illness had dropped to 40%, although still a lot higher against deaths. This was seen as the sign that vaccinations given in January and February are wearing off over time. In light of these findings, Israel became the first country to decide on a programme of booster shots for over 60s, which they did in late July. At that stage, there was no evidence to say whether or not the booster shots would even work. At the time when the booster programme started, vaccinated and unvaccinated Israelis over 60 years of age were catching the Delta variant in about equal numbers. Bear in mind that still suggests the vaccines are doing a great job, because around 94% of the over 60s are vaccinated. So for half the cases to be vaccinated shows that a much smaller percentage of people from that group are being affected. One thing that we've seen over the last month since then is that the booster programme does result in a significant improvement. In the last month, the rate of hospitalisation amongst unvaccinated, represented in this graph by the blue line, has started to significantly outstrip the vaccinated, which is the green line. So it seems pretty likely that all the wealthy countries will be signing up for some form of booster programme for the autumn. The big question though is, what does this all mean for public policy? In a number of countries, we continue to see a significant variety of different approaches, accompanied by some fairly fraught and moralistic debates amongst the wider population. If you go into a lockdown or follow other restrictive measures, so far that has always been justified by the need to reach some end point. In the early stages, the end point was simply to get to the end of the wave of infection without overwhelming the health services, flattening the curve. Because if the health services get overwhelmed, more people will die who would otherwise been able to be successfully treated. In the more recent stages, it's been about restraining the virus spread until a high enough percentage of a population could be vaccinated to achieve herd immunity. And the fact that some people would prefer not to be vaccinated, and that would prevent the population from getting to that percentage, that became a source of anger and heated debate and so on. But it now seems likely that a total protection through herd immunity is, to quote the Oxford Vaccine Group, mythical. The current vaccines make a huge difference and will be part of our route back to normal life, but they're not enough to get to zero COVID. Government ministers have been talking the rhetoric of looking toward the point where we learn to live with the virus, as we do with the flu, accepting that some people are going to die from it every year, not spending a lot of time focusing on that other than encouraging people who need it to get their annual shots. And that has been the occasional rhetoric. It isn't yet reflected in how we're behaving. And particularly in the US, where things are complicated by the politicisation, the fact that some states are well vaccinated, others have been much more vaccine resistant, so are populations that are nowhere near even nominal herd immunity. Some states that have been experiencing a Delta surge look as though they may have peaked, which is good news, although it's early days. So the moralistic and politically partisan debates are still raging there. And yet it's now hard to envisage. What's that end goal? What is the point that we now have to get to in order for society to begin to behave as normal? And right now, there's no obvious answer to that. Some are politically still wedded to the idea of zero COVID achieved via vaccine, but at some point you have to look at the situation and realise that that's almost certainly not going to happen. Doesn't mean it's not worth trying to persuade more people to get vaccinated. Fewer of the vaccinated are dying than the unvaccinated. It will save lives. But it has become a deeply entrenched identity thing. Indeed, so entrenched that even former President Donald Trump got booed by his own audience when he urged them to get vaccinated. Think about that. For at least some of his audience, and I'm sure it was a minority, their identity vis-a-vis the vaccines has become more powerful than their original view of themselves as MAGA Trump supporters. One of the things that hasn't helped addressing that, of course, has been the potent myth circulating to suggest that there is a readily available, cheap, powerful and safe alternative to the vaccines, something that the other political lot don't want you to take, which of course just makes it more attractive. At various points, I've discussed ivermectin on this channel, observing that the direction of travel for the evidence seems, for the moment at least, to be against the idea that it's an effective treatment against COVID-19. This week I noted this exchange with one of the authors of a meta-analysis on ivermectin, Dr. Andrew Hill. Hill's meta-analysis was one of the two, alongside that of the ivermectin advocate Tess Lawrie, that found a positive effect for ivermectin. You may remember that I reported here that one of the constituent papers of those studies was discovered to have been potentially fraudulent. I pointed out that according to researchers, this was a significant study, the removal of which changed the outcome of those meta-analyses. Now, Tess Lawrie suggested that wasn't the case at all and has not retracted or reissued her meta-analysis. Dr. Andrew Hill, however, tweeted this in response to a commenter quoting his own study. Our meta-analysis of survival for ivermectin had to be retracted after one of the main studies was suspected of medical fraud. With the revised version, there is no statistically significant survival benefit for ivermectin. This is something people should probably bear in mind if they hear people suggesting that you should choose to self-medicate, and especially if you should at any point find yourself tempted to take medicine formulated for horses. I always say don't take medical advice from YouTubers, but I did make one exception for this in the past, and I'll say it again. Don't take medicine for horses. Well, I guess I don't have enough viewers in Mississippi, or else they simply rejected that rather clear advice. Now, Mississippi health officials have issued warnings to residents after a rash of people suffering unpleasant symptoms after taking livestock formulations of ivermectin. Those symptoms are reported to include rash, nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, neurological disorders, and sometimes severe hepatitis. Now, the symptoms people experienced were mostly reported to be mild, 85% of those who called, with just one person being instructed to get further help after he took an extremely large dose. No one's suggesting that people are dropping dead from ivermectin, and if you decode the figures that they've given, they're likely to actually be a rather small number of people. The real danger is if ivermectin turns out not to be effective, but people take it instead of vaccinating and then behave as though they're protected. Mississippi has been the state with the lowest rates of vaccination until recently, when they nudged ahead of Alabama. Interestingly, according to Forbes, Mississippi is one of the states where traditional childhood vaccinations are actually the highest, largely because the state only allows medical exemptions, not religious or personal belief exemptions. It's a reflection of the political nature of attitudes to COVID-19 vaccines and suggested alternative treatments. A community that has no de facto objection to the principle of vaccination has nevertheless been caught up in a larger movement around identity. One of the key organisations promoting ivermectin, the FLCCC, has become increasingly not just pro-ivermectin, but also against the vaccines. This week, one of the doctors associated with it, Dr. Eric Osgood, disclosed that he'd resigned from the organisation because of its anti-vax editorial stance. He said this: "I am truly sorry for any role I served in the turn this took. I still think this medicine will turn out to have a beneficial adjunctive role and needs to continue undergoing study. But chemoprophylaxis does not supplant vaccines ever." There may be some good news on the chemoprophylaxis side though, even if ivermectin isn't it. AstraZeneca has announced that a snappily titled treatment, AZD7442, a combination of two long-acting antibodies, reduced the risk of developing symptoms of COVID-19 by 77%. It's given via injection, and trials so far suggest that it's very long-lasting, with a single dose potentially offering protection for up to 12 months. It's particularly going to help people who are at high risk but who get poor protection from vaccines, for instance because they're on immunosuppressing treatment for cancer or other diseases. Now, I have a friend in that category. It may well turn out to be a lifesaver for him. It's not a cheap drug that you can buy over the counter, and it's not bringing the promise that ivermectin did of something that could support people in developing countries in advance of getting access to vaccines. So it's unlikely to become one of the counterculture medical treatments of choice. But, it's good news anyway. One of the current fears that are hitting people hard is whether their unvaccinated kids are going to be exposed to COVID and at risk of coming to serious harm. And this is what you should expect. Parents want to shield their kids from harm, of course. And the information flying around can be confusing and contradictory. At the end of July, the US CDC's director, Rochelle Walensky, said that vaccinated people could transmit the virus with the same capacity as an unvaccinated person. And that started to fuel the fear, and reports of paediatric hospitals beginning to see more COVID-19 patients in some of the states made it stronger. But although very rare cases of serious disease can emerge, it remains the marginal exception rather than the rule for young people. A recent peer-reviewed study in the UK of 260,000 children, 1,700 of whom were symptomatic, showed that for the vast majority of kids, a COVID infection would show up at most as a common cold. The most typical symptoms were a headache and fatigue. Just 4.4% of children diagnosed with COVID-19 had symptoms after 28 days, and even those that had longer-term effects, most had recovered within 56 days. Evidence has shown that COVID transmission rates in schools are equal to or less than those in the surrounding community, especially for the younger children. And although some people might be inured to taking lessons from Sweden, because of the overclaiming made on its behalf, perhaps by some of the contrarians early in the pandemic, nevertheless, Sweden did not shut down its schools at any point, and the only result of that has been academic achievement in line with previous years, unlike the chaos seen in a number of other countries' schools, not least the UK and the US. But that doesn't mean zero risk. The CDC's National Centre for Health Statistics points out that out of 74 million children across the United States, Over 350 have died from COVID-19 over the course of a pandemic. Those are 350 tragedies. Obviously, the families involved will take no comfort from statistics or indeed much else at the loss of a loved child. Nevertheless, it's obviously an outcome you have to be incredibly unfortunate to experience. And for perspective, more than 1,000 children under the age of 15 die in car crashes every year, and around 6,000 15 to 24-year-olds. In that context, that's a level of risk that most people seem to accept fine. However, what some people have described as muddled messaging from the CDC has had the effect of stoking up fear amongst parents. Stoking up fear is what we've all gotten rather good at recently. Messages around the Delta variant on the theme of younger, sicker, quicker were largely misinterpretations of the data based on the collapse of numbers of older patients rather than real growth in the numbers of younger ones. In the UK, for instance, the Office for National Statistics published a comparison of hospital admissions by age, and it showed that while the percentage of patients admitted was much higher for young people, in terms of actual numbers, young people were being admitted to hospital at the same level or lower than they were at the winter high point. But the number of older people admitted had collapsed due to the vaccine programme. We have some way to go on this, but we are making progress. Treatments are getting better, vaccines, even if they need boosting, have been a game changer, and we should be able to hope that over time, as the virus continues to evolve, it will, as others have before it, evolve to become less deadly to the point where it becomes one of the annoyances of life. The social divisions that have been exacerbated over the last couple of years, they may not go away quite so quickly, and neither may the questions about the origins of COVID-19. Bearing in mind the Biden administration's inquiry should be due to report very soon. But it's still going to be a little while before we reach a state that any of us would describe as normal. Hold in there. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.